kind of affordance in when you want to go back to it and yes, and have detailed kind of details of the conversations. So I'm removing myself and leaving both of you. So can we just establish who is the chair? I think Manolis.
Yeah, that's fine. I think technically it has to be me, but yeah, okay, I'll be the chair then. David, usually we're not so chaotic, but given what's going on, I think you'd understand. So one thing that Sveta and I were discussing a bit earlier was that unfortunately, usually what I like to do is to ask the candidates sort of if they want to present.
Indeed.
Something, and sometimes this is helpful. I don't know if you prepared anything. We don't expect anything much, but somehow most people like this opportunity because it gives like a different medium than the paper to the kind of, it breaks the linearity of the paper and might allow you to share some of your thoughts. But I wouldn't like this to take more than 10-15 minutes. Is that what you have prepared? I'd like to focus mostly, instead of like sort of literature and so on, somehow summarizing the relationship of the pilots with your goals and the timeline. Sort of, we have a lot of questions around that. I don't know if that's what you prepared and you'd like to share something on that.
Indeed, thank you so much. Owing to some wonderful guidance from Kaśka, I've got this down to in between 5 to 8 minutes, so okay. It's fairly quick. And it can be made even shorter based on one slide, depending upon how much of the backstory that you'd like to know. So if you like...
I think 8-10 minutes is okay. So let's do that if you want. Yeah, thanks.
Excellent. Before I share the screen, is there anything else that you wanted to make mention before I start that off? Or Sveta, did you have anything that you wanted to say?
No, I think this would just provide us with a really good opportunity to have a rounded sense of what it is that you have been doing and what you're proposing to do as you move forward. That would be it.
Perfect. Then with your permission, I'm going to do my best to share this screen. And if you'll just let me know that you can see that.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Excellent. All right. Well, before even starting the presentation, and also because of COVID-19 and both of your legendary schedules of how absolutely busy you are, let me at least allow to be put on record how grateful I am that you're both here today, that you've taken some time to review some of my materials and to even talk prior to this. It means the world to me, and it's also not lost on me. So thank you for that. Real quick, here's a very, very truncated agenda, giving you some information as to what has brought me here. We'll dive into the meat of the matter, meaning the research overview and supporting details, of course, some references, and then we can follow on with our discussion. If you're interested in the backstory that brought me to enrolling Manolis as a 55, now 56-year-old PhD student, I'm happy to take 90 seconds to do so, but I do so knowing that Sveta may already be well aware of these facts, and I know that Kaśka knows these. Manolis, if you would just as soon want me to speed through this part, I can pass up on this slide, or I can take 90 seconds or so to walk you through why I'm here, whatever your pleasure.
I think we can afford 90 seconds.
Okay. Fair enough then. So my wife and I have been married for 26 years, and we're parents to a 17-year-old daughter named Phoebe, who was diagnosed with autism at 18 months of age. Phoebe also has a comorbidity of epilepsy for roughly half her life, and I'm telling you this because my lived experience as a parent with a neurodiverse family member is long-standing and well-known at UCL. Phoebe is my muse and my primary reason for pursuing my doctorate. And at the same time, because you're a parent, it should come as no surprise that as parents, we'll do anything for our children. So I've tried to leverage my electrical engineering, my audio engineering, and entrepreneurial skills to Phoebe's benefit by crafting what I believe might be a sensory solution for her and others like her. As a result, I have a deep and lasting desire, nay, a passion to contribute to my daughter, the totality of academia, and of course the neurodiverse community. And speaking of contributions, my wife and I have always tried to turn lemons into lemonade by helping other families who are challenged with autistic children on both a statewide as well as a political level. So here in the United States, I serve on the board of directors at our local university at Florida Atlantic University. They have something similar to CRAE at UCL, but it's called CARD here in Florida, which is the Center for Autism and Related Disabilities. And there I promote, plan, and direct services for more than 5,000 families in the largest 3-county area in our state, which of course is under siege right now by COVID. And finally, on your side of the Atlantic, I'm doing my best to set down roots and cultivate relationships as a UCL trustee, Board of Governance member, and a postgraduate student rep. And there I serve constituencies both of neurodiverse and neurotypical individuals who require various levels of planning, authority, and direct assistance both during and prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, from this point forward, these are the 6 areas that I'm going to discuss to try to give you a view from 35,000 feet of what I've been doing. And I shouldn't take any more than 5 to 7 minutes to go through these. My thesis addresses an issue, an opportunity, and a proposal. And at issue is that 90% of autistic adults report that sensory concerns cause significant barriers, particularly in later life and at school and at work. The opportunity leverages wearable technologies that may monitor their environments and possibly adjust user experiences. And my proposal seeks technologies that may reduce distractions and related anxiety by creating alerts, filters, and guidance, hopefully that can increase their autonomy, their attentional focus, and quality of life. Now, of course, there's a gap in knowledge and some distinguishing research features that I'll describe how the name of my project, Sensorable, endeavors an exploration, a design, application, and testing of technologies that employ artificial intelligence for cognitive enhancement by addressing what I call the big 3. 1, diminishing distraction, 2, lessening anxiety, and 3, whilst augmenting attentional focus. Now, prior autistic studies that predominantly utilize technology are aimed at socio-affective cues, such as facial or vocal stimuli only. Now, Sensorable contrastedly questions a multimodality of tuned awareness that may de-emphasize both ecological and physiological or interoceptive cues through custom interventions. As such, my research differentiates from other autistic studies by monitoring a multitude of disruptions and stimuli, adjusting the user experience, and provisioning bespoke real-time alerts, filters, and guidance. Now, very, very quickly, and this is an oversimplification, but my understanding of current academic literature, which goes much deeper than this, focuses on 3 primary things. Researchers like Top, Junior, and others confirm that there is an autistic community that are persistently disturbed and severely disrupted by sensory issues. Taking that a step further, scholars like South and Rogers suggest that those disturbances may be mitigated through disturbance mitigation may benefit a sizable portion of the community. And Rogers, along with Oldfield, take that to another level, suggesting that the understanding of the lived experience of individuals may help construct mechanisms to improve sensory responsivity. Now, these next 2 slides are the all-important ones. They discuss the research questions and hypotheses, methods, and outcomes. So there are 4 interrelated research questions, starting with what's the lived experience of autistic individuals concerning their views on attentional and sensory issues? To what extent might attentional and sensory technologies be tolerated by this community? The third attempts to question and classify a new line of multimodal learning analytics to better understand autism's heterogeneity. And finally, can the exploration of different supervised machine learning approaches classify data, whether it's environmental or physiological, and contribute to both predictive qualities and higher accuracies necessary to craft alerts, filters, and guidance? There are 3 corresponding hypotheses. First, that yes, sufficient lived experience data can help design and train wearables. Secondly, that multimodal data can be extracted to classify heterogeneity markers. And finally, machine or deep learning combined with old-fashioned artificial intelligence can be used to craft interventions. Now, my methods and studies from the last calendar quarter, in which data collection concluded in June, incorporated an exploratory multiple case and participatory co-design approach that was spread across two distinct participant public information studies, one that utilized semi-structured focus groups and the other online surveys. And right now, I'm embedded in ongoing qualitative and quantitative evaluation that's leveraging discourse, discursive, and contextual analysis, the outcome of which aspires to three things. One, an appreciation of autistic individuals' attentional difficulties, a detailed understanding of the modalities, distractors, and sensory issues affecting their experiences, and perhaps most importantly, the theoretical and computational models that may lead to potential designs of an assistive technology prototype. And my study was partially funded by the NIHR, the NHS, and the UCL hospital grants, involving 15 participants within the focus groups and 196 survey contributors that resulted in vivo data that yielded individual expressions and exploration diagrams, word clouds, dimensional cross-tabulations of quality of life, sensitivity and attitude adjustments, SPSS demographic histograms and frequency statistics that describe multiple sensory cues, and amazingly 6 common themes that range from sensitivity impact on performance to technology tolerance. And while it's still early in the analysis curve, the overarching result is this: autistic community interest, desirability, and tolerance match well to their lived experience, so much so that 81 to 89% of the participants favor a deeper exploration, testing, and desire to use wearables to combat these sensory issues. From a methodological standpoint, and prior to my PPI, I completed 4 studies, including what you mentioned earlier, pilot experiment of sound impairment effect of cognitive skill performance that we might talk about later, a second pilot to determine the best integrative development environments, or IDE, to move from face-to-face PPI, which I hoped to conduct in Bloomsbury, but owing to COVID-19, had to be migrated online for data acquisition and analysis. And finally, at Kaśka's suggestion, I wrote 2 positional papers to develop: 1, criticality, defense, and refinement in proposing machine learning and convolutional neural networks, and 2, another detailing deep learning and multimodal learning analytics to address autism's heterogeneity. The following details, the following details my research intention to moderate 4 sensory domains, including visual distractions identified through unusual pupillary movement, environmentally linked head sway signatures detected by inertial movement units, or IMUs, disturbing frequencies, amplitudes, localization, and other sonic anomalies detected audiometrically, and addressing anxiety and attentional focus utilizing GSR, heart rate, interoceptive signals, and that connect up to haptic guidance and bone conduction transducers. And this penultimate screen describes my ambition toward multi-sensor data fusion in human activity recognition, and includes describing theory and computational models to help bridge MMLA and deep learning AI gaps, integrating multiple mobile and wearable sensors to increase reliability and reduce uncertainty, and defining what's been termed as an autistic activity recognition pipeline, through which a stream of data consisting of collection all the way through evaluation can be made possible. And finally, the last screen. As you may have seen on page 56, figure 11 of my upgrade report, my timeline reveals that I'm both on budget and on time by completing the doctoral training ahead of schedule and reducing the scope of my original PhD proposal by removing the randomized control trial and the project postmortem. I now have time to refine, refocus, and narrow my research for targeted, purposeful study that's rooted in theory, computations, and possible subsystem prototypes. Now, all of this aspires to creating a rigorous thesis, leading to what I hope will be a postdoc in Bloomsbury, with a commitment to further reimagine, design, test, and implement an actual project, a comprehensive one that is hopefully fully funded. These are the references that you may have already seen before, that I'm bolting through quickly. And of course, we have plenty of time now for this.
Sure. Well, thank you. That's really what was it? Was not even 10 minutes. So thanks, and it was very comprehensive, and it helps it already helps for people like me who find this linear kind of paper a little bit challenging.
Thank you.
I don't know, Sveta, if we have immediate questions on this, or we want to kind of take a step back and kind of, let's say, start from the beginning.
Oh, I think your mic's muted, Sveta. Sorry.
Sorry, I'm mute. I think it would be helpful for us to step back so that we can kind of delve into more of your thinking, more of your experience in thinking. You've certainly outlined the overall approach and emphasis that you have, and that's really welcome. But it would be nice to just delve in deeper, because that's really what we have in your upgrade report. And so, yeah, I think that would be helpful, just to go through some of the things that you've written about. And also, I think the purpose still remains that sense of an overall perspective of what you're intending to be able to contribute towards. And also making sure that you secure your PhD in time. So would that be helpful for you as well, Manolis?
Yeah, I think so. That and kind of for David's information, I think it's mostly some of the questions and now our angle kind of on all this is towards what Sveta just mentioned, that our goal is to try to make this even more robust than you are planning to. So if we can, so take the questions are kind of in that spirit. Okay.
Yes.
Right.
So shall I start off?
Yes, please.
I guess partly because I do know of David's work, and not in great detail, of course, but he is an online PhD student, and as tutor and module and program lead, I do have some insight into his development, at least, very much more in relation to his skills development. But one of the things that we wanted to clarify with you is that, so you mentioned the overall aims, and so of your overall research, so the whole project as such, and we can recognize that this is not just a PhD project. You mentioned your own experience of engineering, you mentioned your experience of entrepreneurship, and certainly in your presentation, you recognize that, you know, very, very clearly. And so therefore, we have some even more insight of the direction that you want to take post thesis. But in terms of, so what our aim is, just reiterating what Manolis is saying, what we want to be able to do is we want to be able to have these conversations so that we can appreciate what you'll be able to achieve given the time that you have. And you've attempted to do that in your report. So let's just start with an overall intention of goals that you have, that you feel that you can achieve. You've mapped out very clearly your literature review, and you've got your methodology of all the different aspects of contribution you want to make in terms of research. And there are 3 component parts to that, so that's very clearly stated. And then, of course, you've got the work that you're doing in terms of producing your papers, all of your training that you've undertaken as well. So we've got a good appreciation of just what your experience is. So we want to focus in or narrow down into what you can, what your aspirations are for this particular research project, so the PhD itself. So just start off by saying what you would perceive as feasible goals that you would be able to achieve with respect to any aspect that you want to start with? Okay, so just in general, so we can kind of delve in deeper.
I'm happy to do that. And I think if we can put aside my initial aspirations of creating a prototype or a product or anything else that might be down the road, I'd like to address those initial thoughts as it applies purely to academic objectives. And before I talk about specifically what I'm hoping to accomplish during these next few years, I want to pit that against what's already out there. And as a parent, as well as an emerging academic, what seems to be terribly missing. And by way of example, there's no shortage of autistic studies, technology or otherwise, that relate to behavior, communication, socialization, genetics, and even that which falls under the umbrella of something called restrictive repetitive behaviors and interest, or RRBIs, for which sensory issues are diagnostically related. But nobody has at all, well, I don't want to say nobody, but there's a certain paucity of studies and research relating to later life scenarios, not child or adolescent or infant diagnoses or anything along those lines, but later life reports and studies that target what happens to these individuals once they become 18 years of age or older, and they move on to either try to get a job or they try to navigate higher education institutions and are bombarded by these RRBIs, and specifically not those that are ideational or repetitive physical movements, but those that prevent them from navigating the sensory landscape, either interoceptively or as a result of the environment or the ecology. And my goal is to address that not only by hopefully creating germane reports and data, but also to, as Kaśka taught me, scaffold that stuff up, because it just seems to be conspicuously absent. So instead of filling a gap related to all RRBI things that seem to be covered to death at this point, I really want to look where people are not looking, but at least the community is telling me is still an issue. Does that help at least kickstart the conversation?
Yeah, that's useful. Yeah.
Sorry, I think she's muted again. Thanks. It's okay. You're being so kind, muting.
I just
You don't want to hear. You don't want to hear my children behind.
Thanks.
Yes, wonderful. So if Manolis, you're okay, I'll just carry on for a bit longer. Just to set the frame with respect to the project itself. So certainly, we can appreciate for the sensorable research project, you're proposing to provide sufficient evidence that you can gather from what we're understanding from your report, 3 potential methodologies. Gather that evidence in order for you to be able to propose your prototype. And I think we've all appreciated that originally you'd intended to have that as something that would be part of your project, but clearly now it won't be. And so it would be helpful if you would just be able to provide us with your perspective and what you hope to achieve that enables you to almost pave the way forward for this new line of academic thinking, this new line of social contribution that you're intending to make, just as you've outlined already, that this is not just about filling a gap that already exists, this is about much more. But if you could just home in on the methodologies, what that would enable us to do is to then begin to think about the actual approaches that you're using, but then come back to your literature. Rather than doing it the other way around, I think it would be really helpful to have this defining of your goals in relation to your methodologies. Yeah, because they all link, they're all related. So we want to get a sense of each individual and then bring them all together so we see the complete picture.
In answering your question, is it at all useful to even take a further step into ontology and epistemology, or not necessarily?
Not right now. Let's do the literature review, the theoretical ontological perspective a bit later on, because I think what we would like to do very quickly and very early on is to get a sense of the practical goals that you have that can be achievable. And once we've got that in place, then it's very much more straightforward to start having those more kind of esoteric discussions that are much more discussive than and practical as such.
Sure. Having already covered at least the first three links relating to the literature and how they fuse into the methodology, something that I didn't mention in this presentation, but it is part of the overarching report, is that there's no shortage of technologies that have tried to bolt themselves onto autism. And certainly here in the United States, it's a tremendous money grab. And it's maddening if you're a parent because so few of these have any real science behind them. At further issue and related to the methodology is this ongoing issue of heterogeneity. And if I can use a phrase that seems to pop up here constantly in the States and maybe on your side of the Atlantic as well, that phrase is, once you've seen one person with autism, you've seen just one person. That which may disturb an individual from a sensory standpoint not only modulates from individual to individual. For example, a loud sound might bother us as neurotypical individuals, but what I've come to learn is that some autistic individuals, or those diagnosed with autism, forgive me, are not necessarily bothered by those particular problems from moment to moment and from individual to individual. The reason why I'm mentioning this, it is my hope to, through my methodology, gather enormous amounts of data and figure out, is there a way in which to parse this, silo it somehow, so that multimodal learning analytics and deep learning and whatever particular theoretical framework, and we can get to that in a moment too, can be used to best understand and hopefully provide very solid science that says when this particular scenario happens, a propensity of people can benefit by this type of mitigation or this type of guidance or this type of crafted filter or this type of alert. And in so doing, I'm going to, and this brings me back to the very first thing that I said during this part, is that I'm going to try to take the underpinnings of technology and how they're ascribed to autism in a completely different direction, one that doesn't necessarily provide with behavioral cues or social cues, but one that can provide transformational assistance to what I'm told is a very common and debilitating issue that we would not expect other individuals, for example, who are sightless or non-ambulatory, to try to navigate their ecological environments without some type of assistance. But nobody seems to be paying attention to this. So my methods are ascribing to try to make sense of that entire constellation of cues and stimuli that are bothering people and try to make some mathematical sense out of it, some scientific sense out of it, and then hopefully some methodology that can apply that to some type of solution. Does that make sense? Am I answering your question?
So I think you are, but I'd like to maybe just dig a little bit deeper in this last part, because I think it's the area I'm less familiar with, but it also seems to be kind of the core of what you'd be getting into. And to some extent, you're just touching on the surface, scratching the surface of this in the appendix. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, especially on this, how do you call it, study number 3 or something, and 4, I guess. And so I was wondering if we can go a little bit deeper on that, because I think you mentioned it in your presentation earlier. And reading between the lines, I get this feeling that you appreciate that on one hand, this cannot, for the PhD in particular, it is not feasible to have like a kind of like a product to some extent. And on the other hand, when you're talking about all these different modalities or different aspects you want to monitor or something, I'm still challenged of how this is feasible in the context of a PhD. You could take any of these and maybe make it, you know, a kind of like, say, computer science PhD. But I get the feeling that you want to be able to see the feasibility of this and the bigger picture somehow. And am I right that you want to get into, say, understanding the possible interventions out of this, or the possible, I don't know how to call it, like we use terms kind of differently a little bit, but even now in your presentation, you mentioned intervention. So is that something you would like to explore? Do you see what I mean? That any of these kind of, it's also a matter of where you're hoping to contribute to some extent. And I think, knowing that you have probably discussed these things with Kaśka, I assume we are on the same page on that. So when I'm saying, like, say, take eye tracking, for example, right? One, in computer science, one could do a whole PhD on perfecting sort of eye tracking by, I don't know, like 1%. And that's a contribution to science to some extent, to computer science, okay? Here, or the type of work that I kind of like to do, and Kaśka as well, I hope I'm not putting words in her mouth, something, is this more holistic somehow, and how you take different approaches and so on into account, and I'd like to look at what I would call a kind of the intervention, or the potential using something and being able to sort of have a tangible impact, which is, I think, what you're getting in. So maybe I'm talking a lot. Maybe
Sure.
I should let you expand on that.
Certainly. And I appreciate the question. And this is absolutely something that Kaśka has been very influential in helping me, how should I say this, be less of an American cowboy and entrepreneur and be more of a scholar, to try to pare down and get to something that is not only surmountable, but will be contributory and is achievable. And Manolis, I think you hit upon it a couple minutes ago when you almost used the word, try to get to the underpinnings that could potentially make a prototype possible. And what I'm hoping to gather, at least from the 1.5 million data points that I already have from the surveys and the focus groups, is to find out specifically which of these modalities are most pervasive amongst the group that I at least met with. How much does it extend to the larger community? And because I'm very, very new to the concept of MMLA and AI, is there existing theory and computations that might intersect and support a potential prototyping of maybe one of those modalities. And you use eye tracking and pupillary response. I come from an audio background. So what I tried to do early on with Andy told me was to just construct a very simple experiment, that first one, that has sonic disturbances that are occurring in an environment, and can they be harmonized in such a fashion that a task that has quite a bit of cognitive load attached to it can, through that harmonization, minimize the distraction, not completely get rid of it, but filter it in such a way that performance can be increased, that sensory disturbances can be lessened, and that attentional focus can also be scaffolded up. So my goal is not to even dive back into creating that technology and running those tests, but to first better understand, and this may be what the answer to your question is, for this PhD, understand which of those silos are the most complex and how can they be intertwined with existing literature, or perhaps creating a new line of MLA and AI or any one of these other frameworks, Bayesian or whatnot, that might point to a way that eventually leads to, prototyping. I didn't realize that it was going to be that difficult or that broad at first, because Kaśka and I like to joke, I've been around the sun so many times at this point, I don't have a lot of time left. And that was the rationale behind, wanting to dive in and make something. But I have drank the Kool-Aid, as we say here, and understand the importance of those underpinnings and making certain that there's good and deep science that connects. Right now, I don't know if there's anything that connects to it, but that's what my aim is. My suspicion is that it's there. I just have to ferret through all of it in order to find those intersections and figure out where that Venn diagram is. Does that answer your question a little bit better, I hope?
It does. I think that would be an interesting challenge, and also a suggestion. Again, I'm sure you've probably discussed that, but or maybe it's also a question like, have you thought of ways of doing that? For example, there must be ways where you can, on one hand, kind of keep the bigger picture in mind, kind of keep an eye to the general, as they say, but like look at a very specific thing, very narrow thing, and assume some other things have been done. And have you thought of this, and where are you in that? Because it's not coming through the document or presentation, and I think Sveta wants to add something.
Yeah, I'd like to carry on with that train of thought, but what I'd like to do, what I would appreciate is if you refer to what you've written in your report, because I feel that there are aspects of this exploratory nature to justify this narrowment. You have it in your report, okay, it is there, but there's a complexity there, and I think that's what we're trying to home in on, to say, whilst you have this broad perspective, for each of your three methodologies, you are beginning to explore in order to delve deeper for you to achieve the outcomes that you really want to achieve. But it still comes back to this sense of, okay, what are the goals, the academic goals for this PhD? So that conversation is still ongoing. But I think it would be nice to frame what you're thinking with respect to what you've actually written, because that for us is an overall consideration that we need to make for what it is that you've achieved in terms of your thinking, in terms of your contribution, which is huge, which is paramount. So I just wanted to offer that up to say that as you delve into this sense of narrowment, even if you took, let's just say you took a very stepwise approach, starting with your participatory design, because that's something that we get a sense of that you've almost completed. Mm-hmm. give us a very quick overview of that, because that's something that we are able to comprehend, and then you have managed to achieve that, and specific outcomes are there, they're achievable. But then go on to what has become now the new randomized control trial, the much more basic science that you're proposing to do. And I think that's where you've got a very exploratory nature. There is a sense of potential of what you can do, or the potential that you possibly could do if there's information out there. And I think what we want to be able to get to grips with is, where do you see that, yes, this is the narrowment. I really think if I put my efforts into this aspect of basic science, I'm going to be able to achieve the outcomes that I intended. I'm going to be able to achieve the research questions. So that's part two. Then the third part is your architecture, as I've understood it. Yeah, and that's where you're coming back into the engineering domain. And again, there's more of a little bit more sense of exploration, but certainly much more direction. Yeah, so if you just frame it within those respects, then I think that we'll have an overview of what your academic goals are.
So that I understand the first part, is it that you'd like me to give a little bit more meat on the bone for the preparations and procedures that I went through in order to actually gather the original data, and how that actually took place, and the testing and the marketing and the deployment and whatnot? Or I wasn't quite clear on that very first part. I apologize.
No, that's okay. So is this sense of, as we've been discussing, and you've just had a discussion with Manolis, that you've got a very broad perspective of the various different ways that you can begin to make your contribution, right? And so what we're looking for is that sense of narrowment, what's achievable for you. And what I certainly found in reading part two, which is your basic science, I call that the basic science, and less so in your architecture, which is the third part, what I found was that there was a sense of beginning to define, beginning to narrow. So it is there, but there was still a sense of broadness. So you've done the thinking already, but what is it within what you've written that you can now say, yeah, I think if I focus on this as opposed to focus on that, I will be able to achieve what I want to achieve for my outcomes. The purpose remains exactly related to your research questions for each of your methodologies, but it now is about your PhD as opposed to what you've already done.
Great. So thank you for clarifying that. And I believe I can stepwise go through each of those three questions. With regard to narrowment, I should like to say that there is no shortage of the types of cues and modalities that can bother or distract this particular audience. And the initial focus group, and then certainly the ongoing surveys, have provided the ability for me to narrow down which of those modalities must be at least paramount, because I can't necessarily worry about touch, smell, other olfactory issues. So that which tends to be related to pupillary, head sway, and sound seem to be those primary areas of focus. And to be able to begin to understand that, not only how to detect it, whether through IMU, pupillary, or audiometrically, is something that I've just begun to wrap my arms around. And I believe if it's helpful, you know, I'm going to draw a corollary here to Steve Jobs and the iPhone. Not that I'm pretending to be Steve Jobs, but before Apple bowed the iPhone, 11, 12 years ago, all of those technologies existed, right? There were already mobile phones, there were MP3 audio players, there were digital cameras and whatnot. But the form factor that elegantly brought at least the most important types of technologies together were completed by Jobs and company. And we saw what the outgrowth of that was. So too is what I'm trying to accomplish here, at least from a modality standpoint, in narrowing, trying to figure out which of those components are the most salient to this particular group, and are there underlying frameworks from a theoretical standpoint that can adapt to them. Now, your second point is, how do I begin to move that forward? And I don't want to dive forward to the architecture part of this, but what Kaśka has been very helpful, it was pointing me in directions relating to learning analytics. Because initially I just thought, okay, this is a big data issue, and I'm going to just use certain theoretical frameworks like convolutional neural networks for taking a look at ecological situations and trying to map pictures of what a disturbing scene might look like, and that must be it. But what I'm really trying to do now is train the individual by providing guidance so that over time, that which disturbs them, for example, a certain sound, might be detected even before they are able to gather that through some type of sensor, and give them the necessary guidance to prepare themselves, to stay focused, stay calm, or whatnot, whatever the issue happens to be. And in that way, what I'm trying to do is extend that initial understanding of those broader modalities to something of a stepwise fashion in order to train the individual, provided of course that they want to be trained, to better adapt to that situation. And it may not even be something ecological. It may be, hey, we're detecting that your heart rate is increasing at this particular point. Let's give you a haptic sensor, a haptic warning, i.e. like from your phone that tells you, something, somebody's trying to reach you via text. Hey, we're noticing that this is actually starting to occur. You might want to XYZ, whatever that happens to be. And that leads, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, before you go to the next bit, just to connect these two previous points I have. Are you close to being able to sort of even tentatively kind of pick one of these modalities that you think are more important for that? Like, as you were wrapping up sort of your first part, it sounded like still work to be done there, but I get the feeling from both this PPI and also like sort of other literature and so on, and bear in mind I don't know the area. It sounded like I would hope that you are a bit closer to even kind of guessing where you might want to focus on that. Like, say, this example you mentioned now, that sounds more viable than kind of broader solutions to this. I don't know if you had time or if it is the right time. I'm not arguing that it is the right time to have thought of this, but I'm just wondering.
It's a fair question, and the answer is yes to one of the modalities, at least as it relates to sound.
Right.
The problem, of course, is that I haven't yet scraped through enough PPI data to determine if that's as high, let's say, as visual disturbances. But presuming, of course,
in terms of high as in terms of the
desire from the individuals,
the people's perception. But just to draw the analogy with jobs and other work in the design area, as you probably know, people are not necessarily good at judging what they need necessarily. So, of course, it's commendable you are including that work, but either your intuition, the literature, and the experience, you may guide it somewhere that you think is more or equally viable somehow. Because if that's your hypothesis somehow, your question, then that's a valid question. If you say, I don't know, the PPI results are X, but I want to do Y because of Z, then I think that's still viable. I don't think if on the other hand, obviously you take into account also the results from the PPI. That's even more adequate, but I get the feeling there that you get mixed results for now from the PPI.
Honestly, any answer I would give you would be made up because I just I just gathered the higher level demographic questions. Is this something that would be tolerated? Is this something that's even wanted? And then I'm going to dive in deeper to find out, okay, where exactly, which modalities are impinging more upon individuals than perhaps others. Look, I read somewhere that 80% of the world we take in through our eyes, right? And the rest of it is, and I don't even know if that's true. But having read that, it would probably be foolhardy for me just to at least develop a subsystem right now for audio. But between us chickens, yes, Manolis, I have already thought about and created some algorithms that take distracting spatial information and harmonize it with what's in front of the person so that this doesn't occur. And at least audiometrically, I can keep them focused on something. And depending upon whether it's a frequency issue, an amplitude issue, or a spatial issue, I can filter or completely squelch it using digital signal processing that already exists.
I need to get the door for a second. I'll be back in a second. Carry on with you.
And Sveta, that kind of ties into the architecture, at least on the sonic side of things, only because I've been immersed in that for 35 years. And these are tools that we use every single day to make records and music and whatnot. You know, when you.
I think that what's wonderful is that right now, what you've done for us is you've narrowed an area that clearly you have expertise in, you have some prior understanding and knowledge in. And so if we just take your second methodology now, so when Manolis comes back, we'll talk in much more detail about that. So from your PPI, finish off that work. But if you get to the sense that, okay, I have some really foundational data that indicates that there is an opportunity for me to delve forward into the auditory component, then it seems that that's the logical place that you could go to next. While you do that, then yes, if there's enough time and you feel, right, I can now focus on the visual modality, I will be able to do that. But at least there's something that you can define for yourself that enables you to achieve what you want to achieve, right? And that's what we were trying to get at from this broader perspective. So you've found that now, and we're not going to let go of that, if that's okay. But if we could continue with that, so you've got an indicator from your PPI. Now, if you hold that train of thought and continue with the kind of questions that Manolis was asking, but now take us through, how is it, and you gave a bit of indication of this already, how is it that you can now justify and rationalize the second methodology that you're proposing that will enable you to provide that foundational evidence that you need to be able to move on to the architecture?
I'm just reviewing some notes here real quickly.
Yeah.
So this is the part where I am a novice on, and I need to, quite frankly, read more up on Manolis's work and others who have come before me and really understand the multimodal learning analytics part of this. However, extending the PPI to a much more narrow modality, and then determining where that intersection is and whether or not some of these subsystems that I have in the back of my mind can be fully developed, because I have every confidence that the technology is there. I'm just not certain how, from an MLA and an old-fashioned artificial intelligence standpoint, that all gets harvested. I imagine that a lot of that is going to be just good old-fashioned literature review and continued training. in those particular paradigms, learning another computer language as an EE isn't going to be an issue for me. But finding out which ones fit into that method are going to be critical, especially as I'm going to continue to try to narrow. I could use a bit more guidance with regard to your question as it relates to the second method. Perhaps you might give me a for instance, and I might be able to take what's in my mind and adapt it better to give you a more suitable answer. Would that be possible?
Okay, shall I carry on with this, Manolis? Is that okay? Okay, so from what I've understood of, based on what you've written, for the second methodology, this is where you're framing the more basic science, and this is also where you're framing exactly what you've spoken about. And I think you referred to, this is not my area, so this is part of more of the basic science component I'm more familiar with. It would be helpful to just go through that basic science, which I will go through in just a minute, just to steer you on that.
Thank you.
But you've also mentioned this sense of the heterogeneity and classifying that, and certainly using the multimodal learning analytics to do that. So that's part of what you're endeavoring to do. But then, so it's like, the basic science, and then this multimodal learning analytics, and then you're moving forward into this what is referred to in your respective fields as the supervised machine learning, where you're drawing upon already available validated algorithms. And I think that that's what came through to me as being the foundational aspects of what you're proposing to engage with. So even, and if you could just talk about that, but talk about that with respect to the auditory component of the aspect of the project that you're defining. Because it is there. I mean, I'm just looking here. Where am I? Yeah, just in the methodology, even measures of oral attention. So it's all there, and we can understand it and we can relate to that. And that's just one part. And then we move forward into the next part, and the complexity is there, and the next part, and the complexity is there. So just go through for us. Again, we come back to the practical aspects of what you're endeavoring to engage with in order to rationalize what you're proposing to do.
So thank you for clarifying that. I think I can address it a little bit better and perhaps even apply some good old solid theory to how this might move forward. At least at this juncture, I've identified 7 solid bits of science and theory that can help make sense of that heterogeneity, and most importantly, hopefully provide some of the underpinnings to predict any types of future responses or potential behaviors as a result of sensory modalities that are causing distraction, anxiety, and loss of focus. And I think I addressed these in the upgrade report. They included things like load theory and reverse hierarchy and Bayesian, and a nod to Kaśka again, who, what was it, 16 years ago, she provisioned the concept of modeling these complex dependencies, whether it's sound with light or just a pupillary movement or whatnot, but these dependencies that can be used to engineer some type of predictive alerting system. And I have a fairly decent grasp about how to push that forward, certainly in the sound domain. But where I'm green and a novice on at this point are multimodality and artificial intelligence. I made some notes, and I understand that through MMLA, I might be able to bridge how the individual learns from a proposed system so that in the future, perhaps less guidance and less filtering and less alerts are necessary. But I need to delve deeper into MMLA, and that's my hope over the course of the next year. And then I also need, in order to narrow things down even more, a better understanding of AI to the point of understanding the brain's function and how it might best be organized to combat these sensory and anxiety-prone issues. I'm not at all opposed to, and I see the value in narrowing this down to a modality even further, not only so that the PhD is attainable, but perhaps there may even be a way to leverage that process that might be applicable to sound, and then stamp that out at a future date, at least use the stepwise strategy that I may employ to apply that to another modality. And it's worth mentioning, since you brought it up before too, about the architecture. One of the things that has bubbled up in the first part of the methodology, Sveta, was that whatever intervention is proposed, time and time again, I've been told by the participants in the PPI that they don't want to look any different than anybody else who's at school or at work. And my studies thus far have indicated that a lot of MMLA requires sensors being attached all over your body, and you end up looking completely unlike anybody else in your environment. But for the fact that I've studied Google Glass and its outward-facing cameras and its attachment to mobile technology, one of the biggest things, at least as it relates to sound, and I'm hoping you'll be able to appreciate this because of the narrowing, is that I can't have people at school wearing headphones or in-ear type transducers in which to try to filter sound and to try to help them. But I have experimented with what are called bone conduction transducers, and these can be mounted in any glass. They haven't necessarily been mounted in Google Glass for other than behavioral and socio-communicative type efforts. But these can, in fact, keep the individual engaged in what's going on around him or her, whether it's a workplace or in a educational environment. And my goal, of course, is to try to figure out how can I take those disturbing sonic figures and, again, harmonize them with whatever activity is in front of them, whether it's a lecture, a book they're reading, some type of instructional elements. So I'm hoping, at least from an architectural standpoint, you can see that narrowing come to fore, but I'm just not entirely sure yet how to make sense of the heterogeneity part of it, because every individual's got a different set of stimuli and cue that bothers them, and can, in fact, the mathematics and the formula be built underneath that to parse, filter, and otherwise make sense of it. Does that help?
Yes, so it helps a lot, because what you're now able to define for us is that you have a rationale, there is the purpose, there is the rationale, you have a sense of the methods that you can use that are ecologically valid, just as you've described, in terms of the classroom. And although we have much more sense of this in your report, just how is it that you're intending to be able to generate sufficient data that helps you generate an overall map of the heterogeneity? So this is part of your research question, and I think that logic is what we're looking for here. So you have this as part of your research questions, you have these defined as your hypotheses, but by just being able to narrow this to even just thinking about the auditory modality right now, you were able to stream your way through to give us some sense of clarity of what you're proposing. And of course, as you move forward with your architecture, and certainly with your architecture, I found the auditory component is coming across much, much more strongly when you propose that from that part. If I could end with just one line of questioning before we move on from this aspect of discussion from my point of view, Manolis can ask additional questions about your methodology. You've mentioned the different in your in your report, just in relation to the what's replacing the RCT. You've proposed several methods that you have suggested you may possibly use. I just noted a few of them, and they are cross-disciplinary. So there's certain measures of attention and distractibility that will be related to sensory input, that will be related to physiology. But you've also proposed additional methodologies in relation to brain activities. You've mentioned the EEG. I'm certainly finding that this second methodology is pivotal for you to be able to succeed in your PhD. So one of the last questions that I have in terms of your methodology and your goals is that how feasible do you feel it's going to be for you to be able to collect multidisciplinary data? So is this something that you've already started to delve into, or is that an aspect of learning that you're also going to be engaging with? And again, this comes back to that sense of narrowment, just to make sure we can get you finished in time, support you in that as your reviewers, and then continue your discussion with your supervisor.
I think that's probably going to be the easiest question to answer, because those particular measurements that are related to, let's just say, the neurocognitive side of matters were definitely tied to the RCT, and I think those are going to absolutely be pushed back to a point where they're likely to occur post-doc. I think it's important through my work in the ICN, where I participate in the Developmental Diversity Lab, to start to harvest what are those markers that best line up with autism to be aware of, so that when it comes time, I'll be able to actually, proceed down that route. But at this point, owing to the fact that I have no idea if your country is even going to allow me outside of the U.S. into any shape or form of what might be the EU, I think that's all going to get pushed back. Now, it doesn't obviate the need for me to understand it and get training on it. And I know my secondary supervisor is keen to help me with that. That's Dr. Sarah White. But at this point, I think it's just going to be increasing my fund of knowledge, for lack of a better term, about that in an effort to fine-tune that and get that further down. I hope that addresses that question. You mentioned something also about the narrowing of some of the other systems. I wasn't sure if you were referring to data fusion, which is a new area that I'm onto right now, that really tries to pull forth all those modalities and figure out the best systems and developmental ways in which to help use those components and apply them to the heterogeneity. And I should say that I've discovered through MPhil a variety of documents that are coming out right now, being published, that may in fact intersect with this. I think he's told me in the next week or so some new contributions are appearing in some type of convention publication or something along those lines. But I'm hoping that those will bubble up some things to help me along those lines.
That's great. I mean, certainly you've talked about this later on in your proposal, and you've referred to, I think it's 3 levels of fusion.
Yes.
Correctly, that you're going to be engaging with. So again, I guess it from my perspective, it's that as you move forward in continuing to refine, really, because that's really what we're proposing here, just what's feasible for you, you can come back and you can revisit all aspects of what you're proposing in order to be able to at least provide evidence for some aspects. big picture is there, we see that, but now what you're able to really inform us on is how is it that you're intending to gather your evidence and your data for each of these components. Wonderful. Did you want to say something else?
Yes, I should mention that even though she's not visible now, I'm sure that Kaśka is not the slightest bit surprised, because she has been so instrumental in helping me drive towards a narrowing and a supporting of this type of information. So everything that you're suggesting and the way in which you're guiding me through this is not only appreciative, it's practically expected. And I wanted to thank you for that. Oh, here she is. She's gonna turn on her mic and maybe even.
Yeah, I told you so.
You did tell me so.
I don't want to interfere too much here. Well, not at all. So I am present. I am present here.
You know, one of the things that I read a couple days ago in preparing for your upgrade is that it may be possible that somebody's going to ask you what's the weaknesses and what's the strengths that you've gathered in your research. And the weakness is this: it was just entirely too broad, entirely too ambitious, for lack of a better term, and to be able to really dial in, as she told me so, I think was going to be at the heart of everything. So thank you for bringing that up.
But be reassured, the complexity of what you're intending to do still exists. You see, so I can appreciate very often we need this broad perspective in order to understand what it is that we hope to achieve, but then from there begin to define. And I think in your report, what we were seeing was everything.
Yeah.
All right, and I think that's really why we wanted to, in a sense, focus in and home in on this strength, but also get a sense from you of what is it that you can practically achieve in the time that you have. And I think as you go on to the next phase of your project, you will have that in mind, so that the big picture is still there, but like I say, you're compartmentalizing it as is appropriate.
Duly noted, and thank you. Because quite frankly, I wasn't exactly sure what was going to come next, except this helps frame that demonstrably, so thank you.
Manolis, did you want to come in for any other aspect of discussion?
Just on this, on the methodology, I think we said it a little bit earlier, but just to be clear, by all means, like, explore the MMLA kind of field and agenda, and I think it has a lot to offer. But at the same time, I guess I'm being a bit repetitive now, but given what you just raised as well in terms of the training you need, the time you have, and all of that, I think at some point, very, very soon, you will have to kind of take some hard decisions where I think it will be important to just pretend that some things are there somehow or have been solved, and just focus on the things that you feel more confident you are able to achieve. Like this sort of exploration, for example, with the Google Glasses, with the bone conducting audio and so on. I think that could be, even if it limits you somehow, I think basically to some extent my suggestion, because it's not really a question, is in this question 3, this research question 3 and the whole focus on heterogeneity, instead of kind of being blindfolded somehow into this goal, to just ignore that. And one methodology that might help you in that, and I'm probably a little bit colorful, Kaśka knows, because I always do this Wizard of Oz stuff. I think a Wizard of Oz experiment might help you with that, in that you can maybe even substitute some of the modalities that you don't have, or find ways to even annotate data kind of on the fly. There's so much there. Maybe at some other point, like I can send you some literature and so on. But I'm just worried. I'm really worried for the feasibility of this in relation to if you go down the line of the machine learning and especially if you add multiple modality, the amount of data you'd have to collect for this particular type of work and audience that you have seems very challenging for a context of a PhD. So anyway, again, I think that's something you seem aware of right now, and that's the important bit, but it will be something to take into account very, very soon, how to narrow it down. I don't have right now necessarily suggestions, but that's something to think of.
If I may, your connection cut out, I think at a critical point, and I'm hoping either Kaśka or Sveta may have heard it. You said to substitute something, and then I don't know my end. I apologize.
Manolis was talking about Wizard of Oz methodology, which we can discuss later. This is also being recorded, so you can revisit the precisely what Manolis has said. But I think the key point here is that, and this is something that we have been discussing at length over and over, is the feasibility of doing all of what you are proposing, and especially focusing on machine learning, which is I mean, you could be doing your PhD just on that.
Yes.
So it's just a hard decision you'd have to take if you are more interested in the I think this combination of question 3 and kind of hypothesis 3, the way you put it earlier, if you're more interested in the feasibility of the machine learning to contribute to prediction accuracy, fair enough. That's something that you're entitled to being interested in this. There's the way I read some of the things you said now and your report, kind of between the lines, I get the feeling you are more interested in the potential of the intervention of sort of what you say, like crafting intervention. And there are so many big questions there that the question of the prediction and accuracy is secondary. And maybe in 5 years it won't be a question, and maybe that's not the question that you have to solve. You don't have to solve everything. You can't solve everything. So, and in fact, again, as an aside, kind of, you may want to assume that some things are solved and even kind of outline them as projects for others. Like maybe you can even think of a master's project or something that it can be sort of outsourced. If it is solved in the lifetime of your PhD, fair enough. If it's not, like, it doesn't break or make your PhD. And also that's a much more American way of doing PhDs as far as I understand. So maybe it will suit you. But I honestly mean that. It's not my place to kind of tell you where you'd be more interested in, but if there are big questions around the feasibility from even from this, how did you call it, like whether the technology is tolerated, there are all of these issues around what you just mentioned in terms of how visible that makes my autism, or even if there are possible interventions. I think this is exactly the area where a Wizard of Oz methodology usually helps. And at the same time, it allows you to collect data and use them as a secondary sort of question in terms of prediction and accuracy in the machine learning techniques. I've done some work on that in completely unrelated area. I can send this to you earlier. Maybe you can find how to transfer this to your context.
Excellent.
Yeah, it's just my thought now around that. I don't think there's a right or wrong answer right now, but that's something that at least you seem aware of, and that I think you'd have to really kind of narrow down very quickly.
Thank you.
Yeah.
No, I've heard of Wizard of Oz, and it's starting to pop up now in my literature research. But anything that you might be able to, well, once you settle down later this summer, I'm hoping to loop back with you and connect up and have some deeper discussions about this. So thank you.
Sure. So I'm going through some notes here.
Yeah, I just wondered, is there anything else that we wanted to talk through? Any other aspect of your project, and also I think that for me, just to round things up, the only other aspect of discussion I have is actually just in relation to the ethics of your study. So the kind of thing that I was thinking about here was actually it's a little bit about the ethics and integrity, and it homes in on, and this is more of a general discussion now rather than something much more specific and practical that we've been homing in on. But there are some aspects of consideration of ethics that relate to integrity and the contribution that we would make to society. So I'm rounding this up just for my own sense of understanding. For your participants, you're engaging a wide age range of students and adults. And we can appreciate why that's the case, because you want to be able to gain a sense of the heterogeneity of presentation and how that relates to all the methodologies that you're using. But there are two very specific contexts within which you're going to be framing your research. You've mentioned education already, but the other is workplace, isn't it?
Yes.
The older generation. So I wanted to get a sense of what are the similarities and differences that you propose in terms of the experience of data contribution that your participants will be making. So are there similarities and differences that you feel that you are already finding? And then as you move forward with your more complex data collection, that you might also find will be in existence. So some sense of similarity and differences there.
Certainly. You know, when you're trying to operationalize cognitive processes, especially for at-risk communities, there's no shortage of ethical implications and issues that extend outward. And this is an excellent question, because I hadn't really thought to silo the educational away from the workplace until you just mentioned it now. I just considered the entirety of the ethical issues, because we contend with them every day, having a daughter on the spectrum. And Kaśka and I have had some deep discussions about, you know, what happens when you attach computing systems and externalized sensors to not only measure, but to potentially craft some type of intervention. And she was and continues to remain very steadfast in maintaining that I am ethically bound to safeguarding those who may benefit by these proposed systems. So I'm going to answer your question under the entirety of the umbrella, but I promise you I will go back and think about this in both the scholastic and the job workplace environments. What we've talked about is to certainly do no harm to anybody. You have to preserve the individual sovereignty of every individual, whether during testing or certainly data gathering. I alluded to this earlier about remaining non-intrusive and in our observations, and I suppose also decoupling is also going to be important. But I think at the heart of it are three things that Kaśka has always taught to me: that fortifying their autonomy, maintaining humane treatment, meaning eliminate bias, and then the most difficult thing to even think about at this point is to not create any unintended consequences that may germinate out of this stuff. I mean, who knows what might happen? But all of these are ethical constraints that I constantly keep in the back of my mind, not only as a parent, but having gone through and submitted for the ethics filings, and then having to resubmit again after COVID-19, and then through your help, Sveta, trying to figure out how to do the disclosure barring, having never had a UK address or EU address for that matter. So a shout out to you for helping provision that. But yeah, this at-risk issue, this at-risk population certainly has its whole host of ethical concerns, and it's always not even on a back burner, but front of mind for me.
So certainly do carry on thinking about that, because it really, my aim is just to, for me to finish off with this line of questioning is really about giving you a sense of perspective in relation to the context that's being experienced by participants. But ultimately, this relates to the, like I say, the contribution that you're making to society. And certainly, from my perspective, one of the key areas of differences in context is in relation to the very foundations that exist within the organisation of education organisation versus corporate. And you will find differences in terms of key stakeholders who will be supportive of your work, supportive of promoting your data collection. But there are differences with respect to how they will engage with you to enable you to be able to collect the data that you want. Although I recognise that you are approaching people as individuals, not necessarily within organisations. That's why I've just framed this particular line of question as an open discussion for you to carry on to think about in relation to the societal context, really, that is here.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, I could speak with you at length about that gap in society, not only that is not afforded to this particular group of individuals, but to just the shortage of research dollars and whatnot that are ported towards them. It's amazing. I don't know if you saw this study not too long ago. The LSE found out that the amount of money that was attributable to autism outstripped, I think it was cardio, cancer, and 4 or 5 other silos combined. Yet the research is completely the opposite in terms of support. So, and I think that's dwindling as the umbrella of the diagnosis continues to ever widen. So ethically, yeah, it's a very charged debate, especially the differences between how autism is viewed as a dis-ease here in our country and a difference in your country. So don't get me started. I'll get on my soapbox at that point, because I ascribe to the way you all think of it rather than the ethical constraints placed here as something to be cured rather than celebrated. So thank you.
Thank you.
Sure.
Yeah, I don't have much to add here. I haven't sort of explored or thought about this a lot, but I think it is important, and it has also kind of links back to this discussion we had a moment ago about the methodology, about the importance of machine learning and so on, because there are some kind of politically contested things around this as well, particularly in terms of sort of transparency of data and algorithm process and so on around the machine learning. So you might start getting into these issues as well, apart from the kind of basic ethics issues around this work. And so maybe that's another reason for, so it's not just taking this into account,
Yes.
into like ethics procedures and so on. That's we take this for granted, but it may have profound implications for your research design. So have a think on that, outside the kind of thinking in terms of what a product could be later on. And kind of a small point is that kind of related. I'm not sure if I'm making if it's a bit of a leap of thought, but it's kind of related at some point. Maybe even today you mentioned like prediction and accuracy, and although even I in the past have done a lot of work around that, and I was more concerned than maybe I should have been. With the benefit of hindsight, sort of, you talk about best at some point. Like I cannot find it. I was trying to find it. You talked about like the best approach or the best system. I don't think there is one, and or that it should necessarily concern you for the PhD, at least at the context of the PhD. So it's just, again, it's kind of a comment rather than a question, but just keep this in mind and think of the implications that this has for your research. Yeah. But I don't have anything else for now. I think I'm covered. We need to have a brief meeting with Sveta and also sort of write up the formality of the reports and everything, which, particularly given what's going on, we haven't had the time. How do you want to proceed, Sveta? So we have
yes.
a brief meeting.
Yeah, that would be helpful. That would be a nice way to finish off the conversations that we've had and just give us time to reflect.
Okay. So can we assume that you will take yourself off to another Teams meeting or whatever? Or should we, and we can stay here with David, or how do you want to?
Okay, it doesn't matter really. We are online. I'll call Sveta, I'll hang up here and I'll call Sveta and we can join back here, okay?
Okay, perfect.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye.
Thank you very much, David.
Thank you so much.
We'll see you soon, maybe in 5-10 minutes max.
Yes, take your time. We'll be here.
I'm not going
Okay.
anywhere. I'm not allowed to. Thanks.
David, we can probably stop recording. We can probably stop
you're right
recording.
about that. Let me grab that here.